At a high-stakes political event, former Vice President Marco Rubio publicly insults current Vice President Jonathan Roumie in a shocking exchange that catches the attention of everyone in the room. But just as the moment intensifies, Jonathan Roumie calmly responds with one jaw-dropping sentence, leaving Rubio speechless and the audience stunned. What he said could shift the future of conservative politics. It was supposed to be a routine political summit, another day of speeches and promises. The Capitol Grand Hall was filled with the nation's most powerful conservatives, gathered under chandeliers and bright cameras. President Donald Trump had just left the stage to thunderous applause, and now it was Vice President Jonathan Roumie's turn to speak. But before Roumie could take a step forward, a voice sliced through the room. It was former Vice President Marco Rubio. "Let's stop pretending," Rubio said, walking up to the microphone without invitation. "We all know Jonathan Roumie isn't a leader. He's just an actor, reading lines, a political puppet." The room gasped. Every senator, journalist, and camera lens turned toward the confrontation. Jonathan Roumie didn't move. He simply looked at Rubio, his expression unreadable. Rubio smirked as if proud of his words. "You have no spine, Roumie. Just another follower hoping for crumbs from the script." Silence followed. Even the Secret Service looked confused. Then slowly, Jonathan Roumie stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't raise a finger. He just whispered something under his breath. Calm, chilling, and so sharp it cut through the air like glass. And with that, everything began to unravel. Jonathan Roumie looked Rubio dead in the eye, his voice low but carrying across the hushed room. "Marco, if speaking with conviction, even when it aligns with another's truth, makes me an actor reading a script, what does that make you? A politician who changes roles to suit the audience? Or one who believes his own fiction?" Gasps again, audible, real. Someone in the back dropped their glass. Rubio's face tightened, but Roumie wasn't done. "I stood by a president who stood by this country. You shifted your stance the moment the spotlight turned, right into the arms of people who questioned everything you used to say you believed in." Roumie's voice never rose, but every word shook the room. Reporters scrambled to type. Senators leaned in, stunned. "You called me an actor," Roumie continued. "You acted out of fear. I acted on truth. And unlike you, I never turned my back on the American people." Marco Rubio's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And then the crowd reacted. Quiet applause at first, then stronger. President Trump, watching from backstage, simply nodded. The war of words was no longer words. It was war. Rubio tried to walk off, tried to escape the spotlight, but Jonathan Roumie took one more step forward. He wasn't finished. "You want to talk about loyalty, Marco?" Roumie asked, voice calm but slicing. "Where were you when the country was divided in 2020? When the media spread narratives that hurt our nation? When our communities questioned their future? Where were you? You hid behind cautious statements while real Americans suffered. Cameras were rolling. The live stream viewer count jumped past 2 million. Rubio turned back. "You don't understand what it takes to lead," he muttered, his tone shaky. "No," Roumie said sharply. "You don't understand what it means to stand." He looked out across the room. "Leadership isn't bowing to polls or ducking responsibility. It's choosing what's right, even when it's unpopular, even when it hurts. Something you used to believe in before you sold your principles to people who will never truly respect you." Rubio's face drained of color, and then Roumie delivered the final blow. "You were once a respected voice in this party, Marco. Now you're just another echo in the establishment's chamber. History won't forget." And at that moment, Rubio looked like a man who knew he had already lost. The room wasn't just shocked, it was wounded. People whispered, reporters huddled, senators exchanged glances. Rubio stood stiffly near the podium, realizing he had walked into a firestorm. Jonathan Roumie walked slowly past him, turning toward the crowd, then the cameras. "This isn't about me," Roumie said, voice steady. "It's about truth. And the truth is, some men wear the title of leader but sell the soul of their office to keep dinner invitations from the other side." Rubio clenched his jaw. His eyes darted toward a group of donors. Some had already turned away from him. Roumie wasn't finished. "You betrayed not just President Trump. You betrayed every voter who trusted you to defend them, even when it was hard. And now you stand here calling me a puppet." A young woman in the audience started crying. She remembered losing her job during economic downturns, while Rubio seemed to equivocate. Roumie's words had cut deep. This party isn't perfect, Roumie said, turning to the people. But we don't need compromisers. We need fighters. And I won't let history be rewritten by the man who shied away from the fight. The crowd erupted. Rubio was already shrinking. Marco Rubio took a breath. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. You think you know what it's like to sit where I sat? You weren't there, Roumie. You don't know the pressure, the chaos. I do, Roumie interrupted. And I stood firm. The hall froze again. Rubio's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at Roumie. You're a child in politics. You wrote on Trump's name. I helped build that legacy. You're just walking in shoes you didn't earn. Roumie's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he said quietly, the difference is I never spat on the man who gave me the platform. A low murmur echoed across the room. Roumie stepped forward again. You act like you carried the burden. But when it mattered, you let the media write the ending. You handed them the pen. A few members of the audience nodded. One man in a veteran's hat stood up and clapped, alone at first. Roumie turned to the audience. Leadership isn't about avoiding pain. It's about standing in it and still saying, I won't back down. Rubio looked like he'd aged 10 years and 10 minutes. He tried to smile, but even he could feel it. He was losing the room. Roumie turned slightly, reached into his inner jacket pocket, and pulled out a small folder. This, he said, holding it up, is a copy of communications between former Vice President Rubio's campaign staff and multiple Democrat-aligned super PACs, dated just weeks after a critical policy vote. Long before he told the public he was praying for clarity, he was negotiating consulting fees and future endorsements. The room gasped. A journalist in the front row stood to snap a photo. Rubio's eyes widened. That's confidential, he barked. Roumie replied coolly, not anymore. The redacted version was cleared last night. I made sure of it. Transparency isn't betrayal, Marco. Lying while smiling is. Roumie laid the folder on the podium. This isn't revenge, it's revelation. America deserves to know who you became after the cameras went off. Rubio's shoulders slumped. He had no words. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was grave. Even Trump, still backstage, whispered to an aide, he just ended Rubio's career. The truth had landed, and Rubio finally realized he hadn't insulted Jonathan Roumie. He had awakened him. After Jonathan Roumie revealed the folder, the silence inside the hall turned into a quiet storm. Whispers buzzed from seat to seat. He had proof. Rubio really did that? Why would he cut deals with the same people who called him a traitor? Roumie stood still, letting the truth settle. He didn't gloat. He didn't grin. He looked heavy, like a man who carried a burden he wished he didn't have to show the world. Rubio stepped back from the mic, his face pale. His hand went to his suit pocket, fumbling with nothing. The lights felt hotter on his forehead. A few senators looked away, embarrassed by the man they once praised. Even a conservative pundit who had flown in for the event quietly folded his hands and bowed his head. Roumie cleared his throat. Marco, you said I was an actor, but actors don't expose the truth. Traitors hide it. A woman in the front row, older and wearing a flag pin, wiped tears from her eyes. Rubio tried to speak again, but his voice broke. This isn't fair. But Jonathan Roumie had only just begun to uncover what needed to be told. Roumie turned back to the crowd. He scanned the faces, some shocked, some furious, some visibly heartbroken. I didn't want it to come to this, Roumie began. But we cannot fix a country if we protect those who hurt it from within. He pointed at Rubio, not with his hand, but with the weight of his words. When our values were under siege from political opportunism, you chose silence. When Americans needed backbone, you offered press releases. And when it mattered most, you turned your back on the man who gave you his trust and the people who believed you'd defend them. The audience stood still. Roumie looked over at a young man holding a military photo. That's your brother, right? The man nodded slowly. He served while people like Marco Rubio signed deals behind closed doors. And that's why I won't be quiet anymore. Gasps gave way to claps. The claps grew louder, then a full standing ovation. Marco Rubio's eyes darted to the exit. He looked like a man drowning in a storm he thought he could control. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't done. The truth was still unfolding. Just as the clapping settled, a new energy filled the room. The back doors opened, and there he was, President Donald J. Trump. He didn't speak. He just walked down the center aisle slowly, his face unreadable. The cameras spun around. The crowd shifted. Marco Rubio visibly tensed. Jonathan Roumie turned toward Trump, nodded once, then stepped aside respectfully. Trump stepped up to the podium, looked out at the room, and then glanced briefly at Rubio. You know, Trump said, I've been watching from the lead, and I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am right now. Roumie's face didn't show pride. It showed resolve. Trump placed a hand on Roumie's shoulder. Loyalty isn't blind obedience. It's standing up for what's right, even when it's ugly, even when it's painful. Then Trump turned fully to Rubio. I trusted you, Marco, and you broke that trust. But the worst part, you didn't break mine. You broke America's. Rubio looked away, and then Trump said it. You called Jonathan an actor, but today he wrote your final scene without touching you. The crowd broke. Some cheered, others cried amid, and the room belonged to Jonathan Roumie. Now the room was packed, yet not a single cough, whisper, or shuffle could be heard. The nation was watching live. Every major news network had cut into programming. Twitter was on fire. YouTube streams were spiking by the second. Rubio stood there blinking fast as if trying to reset the moment. But the camera didn't blink with him. Jonathan Roumie stood behind the podium now, with President Trump standing close by, arms folded across his chest. America isn't perfect, Roumie said, looking into the crowd and through the lens of every live stream. We've been bruised. We've been lied to. But nothing wounds deeper than betrayal from those we once called brothers. He didn't even look at Rubio. And when a man chooses applause from the enemy over allegiance to the truth, Roumie added, he becomes smaller than his own shadow. Someone in the crowd choked back a sob. Rubio turned and glanced at the exit doors again, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Roumie lifted the folder again. This isn't personal. It's painful, but it's needed. America can't heal with the same people who helped break her. Tears were falling now, and the story was only deepening. As the applause faded, a man in a wheelchair was slowly rolled forward by his teenage daughter. Jonathan Roumie noticed him. He paused. Sir, would you like to speak? The man took the mic. His voice was gravelly, weathered. I served under 3 presidents. I lost my leg in Afghanistan, but I didn't lose my faith until the day Marco Rubio prioritized his political future over standing firm with President Trump. Gasps, he pointed at Rubio. You gave speeches about courage, about country, but when the media storm came, you wavered. Rubio couldn't make eye contact. The man turned to Roumie. You reminded me of something I thought we'd lost. Honor. Truth. Jonathan blinked hard. He didn't expect that. The daughter put her hand on her dad's shoulder. He whispered, That's enough. Roumie stepped back to the podium, his voice quieter now. America isn't asking for perfect leaders. She's begging for honest ones. Even some of Rubio's old allies in the front row were bowing their heads. What started as a political event had become a national reckoning, and the heart of it was raw truth spoken through tears. Marco Rubio had always been careful with words, calculated in speech, polished in tone, but now under the heat of Roumie's truth and the weight of the people's grief, he cracked. I tried to do what I thought was right, he finally muttered. I didn't mean to. Jonathan cut in gently but firmly. You didn't mean to what, Marco? Trade the truth for safety? Hurt those who trusted you? Let the media decide who you were. Rubio's voice grew shaky. I just didn't think Trump could win again. I didn't want to go down with him. Silence. Roumie stepped forward slowly, locking eyes with him. And that's why you don't belong here. Rubio's lips trembled. He looked like he might collapse. He glanced at Trump. No sympathy, just stone. He turned toward the crowd, but they weren't with him anymore. A few audience members stood and turned their backs. Jonathan Roumie didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just looked down, then whispered into the mic. Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it. And at that moment, it wasn't just Rubio who was exposed. It was everything he had ever tried to hide. Outside the Capitol Grand Hall, news vans lined the streets like dominoes. Reporters spoke breathlessly into cameras as breaking headlines rolled across the nation's screens. Rubio exposed by Roumie in shocking confrontation. Trump backs Jonathan Roumie in stunning live moment. Inside the hall, Jonathan Roumie was now seated beside Trump. Rubio stood off to the side, no longer at the center of attention. A reporter shouted from the press box, Mr. Vice President Roumie, do you believe Rubio should be removed from the party? Roumie looked up, his voice firm but respectful. I believe we're overdue for accountability, not from the left, but from within, the crowd murmured again. He continued, we lose elections not just because of opposition lies, but because of quiet betrayals that look like politeness. He turned toward Rubio, then back to the press. This isn't about punishment. It's about protecting the truth so we don't lose the soul of conservatism forever. Rubio sat down in the shadows, a broken man, and Jonathan Roumie, His name was rising like a storm no one could stop. Backstage, an aide handed Roumie a small folded letter. "It's from your father," the aide whispered. Roumie paused, took it, and stepped aside quietly. He opened the letter with shaking hands. "Son, I watched you today. I never cried so hard in my life. Not because you were tough, but because you were profoundly honest, even when it hurt. That's what real men do. That's what I struggled to teach you when I was younger. But today, you became the man I always hoped you'd be. You didn't destroy Rubio. You exposed him with truth, not hate, and I'm proud of you, Dad." Roumie wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. His throat tightened. All the cameras, the applause, the noise suddenly faded. Because behind every speech was a son. Behind every stand was a little boy who once needed a reason to believe again. He folded the letter slowly and slipped it into his coat. Now it wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about protecting America's future from men like Rubio and proving to every father and son watching that integrity still mattered. As the program took a short break, Roumie stepped into a quiet hallway. His phone buzzed. It was a private call. He answered. "Jonathan Roumie, Vice President," a woman's voice said through tears. "You don't know me, but I lost my husband last year. He was a small business owner who voted for Rubio twice." Roumie's heart sank. "I'm so sorry. I need you to know," she said, voice trembling. "Today, I finally felt like someone stood up for the people again." Roumie closed his eyes. She continued, "My husband used to say, there are two kinds of leaders, those who talk and those who carry people through fire. You carried us today." He couldn't respond. The lump in his throat was too heavy. "Promise me you won't stop," she whispered. Roumie whispered back, "I promise." As he hung up, he stood alone in that quiet hallway, staring at the wall. This moment wasn't about ego. It wasn't even about politics anymore. It was about healing something in the country that had been broken for years, and that healing had just begun. The event resumed, cameras rolled, lights brightened, but the atmosphere had changed. Marco Rubio rose from his seat slowly. No one clapped, no one stood, not even his old allies. He walked through the center aisle like a forgotten ghost. People moved their eyes away as he passed. He reached the exit doors and paused, maybe hoping someone would stop him, say something, even whisper his name. But there was only silence. And in that silence, the weight of regret hit him like a storm. Jonathan Roumie remained near the stage, quiet, composed. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply bowed his head. A boy in the audience, no older than 9, tugged on his father's jacket and asked, "Why is the man leaving?" His father knelt down and whispered, "Because he forgot who he was," and Jonathan reminded him. Rubio pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the cold air outside. Cameras didn't chase him. No microphones, no attention. Just the sound of his footsteps and a closing door behind him. A chapter had ended, but Jonathan's was still being written by the people. After the final speech of the event, Roumie moved slowly through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding respectfully, listening. An old veteran in a tan cap stood waiting with a cane. His coat was covered in medals, Vietnam, Iraq, and 2 for bravery. When Roumie reached him, the man didn't speak right away. He just looked into Roumie's eyes. Then he held out his hand. "You spoke for all of us today," the old soldier said, voice shaking. "And I've waited years to hear that kind of truth." Roumie gripped his hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, sir." "No, son," the veteran replied. "Thank you for finally serving us." The man's eyes watered. He turned to walk away, but paused. "Don't ever change. We can't afford to lose one more leader who's real." Roumie nodded, swallowing hard. He stood still, watching the man limp away. And then he saw it, people crying. Not because of sadness, but because for once someone hadn't let them down. A woman held her toddler and whispered, "That's our vice president." And for the first time all day, Jonathan Roumie smiled softly. He didn't need applause. He had the people's hearts. Backstage, the weight of the day finally hit Roumie. He sat down alone, shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the floor. President Trump walked in quietly, holding 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Jonathan and sat beside him. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Trump spoke. "You didn't just defend me today. You defended something a lot bigger." Roumie looked over. "I just told the truth." Trump chuckled softly. "Yeah, but the truth costs something. You paid it today." Roumie nodded. "It was worth it." Trump grew quiet, then leaned in. "They love you now, but don't let it change you. Keep being the man who cried over a stranger's call, not the one chasing cameras." Roumie looked him in the eyes. "I'm not here for power. I'm here to make sure no kid ever has to grow up feeling forgotten, feeling like truth doesn't matter." Trump placed a hand on Roumie's back and stood. That's exactly why you'll go farther than all of them. Jonathan sat alone again for a while thinking, and he knew this moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. As the evening ended, Roumie stepped into the back seat of a black SUV. The streets of D.C. looked calm under the streetlights, but his mind was still racing. His chief of staff, Lauren, sat up front, glancing back. "You want to review the headlines?" Roumie shook his head. "No, not tonight." Instead, he pulled out the folded letter from his father again. "Read it slowly." The driver said softly, "Sir, you did something tonight no one will forget." Roumie looked out the window. "I didn't come here to make people remember me. I came to help them remember who they are." They passed by the Lincoln Memorial, its lights glowing, its silence majestic, and Jonathan felt the weight of history pressing against him, not as a burden, but as a call. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled, sticky note. Just 4 words. "Tell the truth always." It was something his mother used to say when he was a boy, and tonight it meant more than ever. By midnight, Roumie's inbox had exploded, not with politics, but with people. Emails poured in from every state. Veterans, teachers, coal miners, single mothers, pastors. Some messages were just a few words. "You gave me hope. You said what we've been screaming for years. I watched with my son. We cried together." One message stood out. It was from a teenager in Kansas. "Mr. Vice President Roumie, I've never cared about politics, but my dad lost his job last year, and we felt forgotten. Tonight, I saw you fight for people like us. For the first time, I feel like we matter again. Please don't ever stop." Roumie read it twice, then read it aloud. His team went silent. He looked around the room. This isn't about winning elections anymore. It's about restoring something broken in our people. They nodded, but behind some of their eyes were tears. Because what happened earlier that day wasn't just a moment. It had become a movement. At 1:34 a.m., long after the news cameras shut off and the streets cleared, Roumie sat alone in the chapel inside the vice president's residence. No staff, no noise, just him and the quiet hum of the night. He lit a small candle, folded his hands, closed his eyes. He didn't pray for power, not even for praise. He whispered, "God, please keep me honest. Help me carry this the right way. And if I ever forget why I started, take it from me." He sat there for several minutes. No lightning, no booming voice, just peace. Then the door creaked open slightly. It was President Trump in slippers and a coat. "Knew I'd find you in here." Roumie smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Trump walked in, sat beside him, looked up at the cross. "You think they're ready?" Jonathan looked ahead. "I think they're desperate for something real." Trump stood, nodded once. "Then let's give it to them." And with that, the 2 men left the chapel, not as candidates, but as warriors for something bigger than politics, something America had nearly forgotten until now. By morning, Jonathan Roumie was scheduled for a sit-down interview with America's most watched political anchor, Karen Dillard. Millions tuned in. "Vice President Roumie," she began, "what was going through your mind when Marco Rubio called you an actor and a puppet on stage?" Roumie leaned back, calm but clear. "Honestly, I was sad. Not for me, for him." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Sad?" "Yes," Roumie said, "because I saw a man who once stood for principles reduced to bitterness in political calculation. He chose applause from the wrong side over allegiance to the truth and the people." Karen nodded slowly. "And what was the sentence you said that silenced him?" Roumie paused. The room leaned in. "I said, you call me an actor for standing by Trump and conviction, yet you sold your soul for a handshake from the people who spit on your values." The audience watching from home erupted online. Twitter exploded with hashtags like #RoumieTruth and #RubioExposed. Karen smiled, almost choked up. "Sir, you may have changed the direction of the party." Roumie looked into the camera. Not changed, reminded. The interview ended, but something else had just begun. The people's fire had been reignited. After the interview, Roumie returned home briefly to see his wife and son before heading back to D.C. As he tucked his 8-year-old boy into bed, the boy whispered, "Daddy, why did that man say you were bad?" Roumie froze. The question cut deeper than any headline. He sat beside his son. "Because sometimes when you stand for what's right, people who are wrong try to make you look weak." The boy's eyes welled up. "But you didn't yell. You didn't hit him." Roumie smiled gently. "Because real strength doesn't scream. It speaks the truth even when your voice shakes, even when the world tells you to be silent." The boy hugged him tight. "You're my hero." Roumie swallowed hard and kissed his head. "No, son, you are mine." As he turned off the lights and he stood at the doorway for a moment, The weight of everything from Rubio's insult to America's pain sat on his shoulders. But so did love. And with that, he knew he had to go back into the fire. For every father, every mother, and every child still waiting for someone to finally fight for them. Meanwhile, Rubio sat in a hotel room miles away, alone. No reporters, no invitations. His phone buzzed occasionally, mostly with cancellations. He clicked the TV. Roumie's interview replayed, the words echoed. You sold your soul for a handshake from the people who spit on your values. Rubio turned it off, tossed the remote. He looked at a framed photo of himself and Trump from 2017, then faced the mirror. What stared back at him wasn't the proud man from years ago. It was someone hollow. He picked up his phone, dialed an old contact, an advisor from his early political days. They're done with you, the voice said. You're not the future. You're a shadow. Rubio sat in silence. For once, he had no defense. The betrayal he thought he could spin had spun him instead. The people had chosen, and they had chosen Jonathan Roumie. In a small town in Ohio, Mrs. Langston stood in front of her 7th grade civics class. The students had just finished watching clips from Jonathan Roumie's speech and interview. All right, class, she said softly. What did you feel watching that? A quiet girl in the back, normally shy, raised her hand. He made me feel like someone finally cared about real people, not just politics. Another student, a boy whose dad worked 2 jobs, added, it felt like he wasn't trying to sound smart or get elected. He was just telling the truth from his heart. Mrs. Langston nodded, eyes misting. That's what leadership is. Not yelling, not pretending. It's standing for something, even when others fold. On the classroom TV, Jonathan Roumie's words echoed again. Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it. One student whispered, I wish my uncle could have heard that before he gave up last year. A moment of silence filled the room. In that small classroom, Jonathan Roumie wasn't just a vice president. He had become a symbol of hope, courage, and what politics was supposed to be, and none of them would forget it. Back at the Capitol, Jonathan Roumie's chief aide, Lauren, knocked gently on his office door. Come in, Roumie said, sipping coffee. She entered with red eyes. Sir, I need to say something. Roumie looked up, concerned. What is it? She sat down, holding back tears. I used to believe in Rubio. I campaigned for him, defended him. Even after he made compromises, I made excuses. Roumie stayed quiet, listening. But after what you did yesterday, she paused, voice breaking, you reminded me why I got into this. It wasn't for status or media. It was to help people, to stand for truth. Roumie stood, walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. We've all believed in the wrong people before. What matters is that we don't stay there. What matters is that we find the truth and fight for it. She wiped her tears. You didn't just expose Rubio. You healed something in us. Something we didn't know was broken. Roumie nodded softly. Then it was worth it. Outside his door, more staff waited. They weren't there for meetings. They were there because they believed again. Later that night, Roumie was called into the Oval Office. President Trump stood by the window, looking out across the South Lawn. He didn't turn around at first. You were incredible, Jonathan. Roumie approached slowly. Thank you, Mr. President. Trump turned and Jonathan froze. His eyes were wet. A man known for his toughness was crying. You reminded me of something I almost forgot, Trump said, voice heavy. That this fight isn't about us. It's about them. The forgotten, the hurting, the heartland, the people. Roumie lowered his head. They need someone real, someone who won't leave them when it gets hard. Trump nodded, and yesterday they found him. The 2 men embraced, not as politicians, but as patriots, bound by truth, loyalty, and love for a country that had nearly lost its soul. And for the first time in years, the White House didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. Early the next morning, Roumie sat by his office window when an envelope marked urgent hand delivered was placed on his desk. No return address, just a name scribbled in blue pen. Mason H., age 11, Nebraska. Roumie opened it slowly. The handwriting was crooked, childlike, but the words were sharp. Dear Mr. Roumie, my dad had used to believe in Marco Rubio. We even had his sign in our yard. But after he changed, my dad said he lost all hope. Yesterday, my dad cried when you spoke. I've only seen him cry once, when Grandma passed away. He said you reminded him of who we are. He said he's proud to be an American again. Thank you for standing up when others were too scared. You're not an actor. You're a warrior for truth. Love, Mason. Roumie folded the letter and held it to his chest. No camera was around, no one was watching, but tears filled his eyes. This is why he fought, not for power, but for Mason, and every forgotten voice like his. While the nation rallied around Jonathan, Marco Rubio vanished from the public eye. His scheduled interviews were quietly canceled. His staff thinned out. The conference invites stopped. Even longtime supporters avoided his calls. One evening in a dark corner booth of a quiet diner in Florida, he sat alone, his phone face down, his plate untouched. A couple walked in, saw him, and quickly chose another table. He stirred his coffee, the weight of regret sinking deeper. He remembered the podium, the lights, the confidence he once had. But now those memories tasted bitter. The worst part, Jonathan hadn't destroyed him with rage. He'd done it with truth, calm, steady truth. Rubio finally whispered to himself, "I underestimated him. I underestimated the power of truth." But it was too late. The tide had turned, the people had spoken, and there was no going back. Back in Washington, President Trump called a national address. Behind him stood Jonathan Roumie, not as a side figure, but shoulder to shoulder. Trump spoke first. "What we witnessed yesterday wasn't just a moment. It was a movement, and it was led by the man standing next to me." Then Trump stepped aside. Roumie approached the podium. For a second, he looked at the teleprompter, then turned it off. "I don't need a script to speak the truth," he said. "America's tired of pretending, tired of polished lees and silent cowards. We want courage again. We want clarity again. We want home again." He paused, his voice thickening. "If standing with a president who put America first makes me an actor or a puppet, then call me one proudly, because I'd rather be a voice for truth than a master of betrayal." The room erupted. Some were sobbing, and across the country, millions felt something they hadn't felt in years. Trust. The future had arrived, and its name was Jonathan Roumie.